which means they don't pay any attention to how long or how short the days are, and they pretty much just flower all the time. The old-fashioned ones, you'll get a few blooms during the middle of the summer, but if you've got a plant, you're doing everything right, and it's just not giving you much in the way of flowers, it probably just is not one of the newer day-neutral varieties. I see people all the time, they grow something like the old Barbara Karst, and they try 15 different things during the summer trying to make it flower. And then about September, or actually probably more like the 1st of October, the thing comes into full bloom, and they give credit to whatever the last thing they did was. They say, well, I finally figured out what it takes to make it bloom. No, you didn't. The thing that made it bloom was having the days get shorter and the nights get longer. But if you get the newer varieties, and I think everything we keep here is going to be the newer varieties, these guys, given the right conditions, can bloom off and on literally all summer long. The only time that they have been known to drop every flower on the plant overnight is when you have a party plant. And if you plan a big party for Saturday, you almost be guaranteed that on Friday they're going to drop all their blooms for one reason or another. But no, they're among the toughest and hardiest of plants. Anyone who has grown them know that they do have some spines on them. So you can do one of two things. You can use them as a barrier plant to keep people and dogs out, or you can plant them away from people if you're worried about people getting stuck with them. They do get quite large. A few years ago I went to Jamaica. Bougainvilleas there will have trunks about this big around on them, and they grow into trees. I understand, I've never been to South Africa, but I understand from people who have visited South Africa, say the trunks are like this big around on the bougainvilleas there.
There's some like that on the south side where I live.
There may be, yeah. And they're just good plants. In the winter months, if they get a heavy frost, you'll get some damage to the foliage, but the plants themselves don't usually freeze back until it gets to the middle 20s or lower and stays there for several hours. So bougainvilleas really have not frozen back much the past few years, and I just think they should be encouraged more and more as a landscape plant. Yes, ma'am?
How do you take cuttings?
Taking cuttings, you want to do mature wood. All of this growth that's coming out right now, when you feel that this is very soft, very, limber wood, that'll just rot if you try to take cuttings from it. I've always had the best results taking cuttings about August or so, when the wood has really hardened, and then it's just the usual. Keep the cuttings fairly short, soak them in a seaweed and water mix for about 30 minutes, and then root them in perlite. If it doesn't work for you the first time, try it again. And I really don't know why one time is better than another, but I've taken 100 cuttings and had 100 of them die, just take no roots whatsoever, and a week later take another 100 cuttings. Seems like you had 110 plants from it. And but in general, if you use mature wood, soak them in seaweed, root them in perlite, you'll do pretty well with them. Anything else about bougainvilleas?
How big do they get, say, after 2 or 3 years, typically?
After 3 years in the ground without a hard freeze, I would expect this plant to be about this size. Got a couple of them for old veterinarian friend Tom Weiss, and planted out on a trellis. I think his were about 12 feet tall after 3 years. So they grow pretty profusely. If we get, some people just want to protect them, or folks up in the hill country that get a little colder than we are, have to protect them in the winter months. And the temptation is always to cut them back in the fall when you move them in. When you cut them back in the fall, because the days are shorter, the light is less intense, the new growth that comes out tends to be kind of weak and spindly. If you need to cut them back, the best time to cut them back is just as new growth starts in the spring. But sadly, when you do that, you're cheating yourself out of a lot of flowers, because that's also one of their heaviest flowering times. So the best bet with bougainvilleas is plant them in a spot that you just pretty much let them grow wild without having to be pruned on.
If they're in the ground, how cold can it get?
It would have to get probably into the middle teens and stay there before it would kill them. It would probably freeze the top back at 22 or 23 degrees. But thing to remember about weather and freezing weather, and again, certainly this winter, if you can call what we had the past few months winter, and most years in San Antonio, it may be 33 degrees at 4 o'clock in the morning, at 6 o'clock in the morning it's 28, and at 7 o'clock in the morning it's back up in the 30s. So your temperatures do this. And especially on an organic program, that doesn't even seem to set them back at all. If you're going to put them in the ground, I guess one thing I would recommend is put some lava sand around the base of them as a mulch. Lava seems to increase the cold hardiness by about 5 degrees. You can also spray things with liquid seaweed in the fall, and that will go for all of your tropicals. If you start a couple of months before the first usual freeze date and spray them about every 2 weeks with liquid seaweed, you'll also lower the temperature about 5 degrees before they freeze. Both the paramagnetic rock materials like the lava sand and the seaweed tend to help the plants accumulate more sugars in the sap. The sugar serves as an antifreeze. So, long answer to a short question. A quick dip down to a lower temperature is not going to bother them at all. When things really suffer is we have one of those times when it gets cold, you know, and stays cold. When it's below freezing at 8 o'clock at night and it's still below freezing at 8 o'clock the next morning. That's going to do a lot more damage than a quick dip. I mean, staying at 29 degrees for, or let's say 28 degrees for 12 hours would be a whole lot more damaging to dipping down to 24 and coming right back up. Again, the only time there probably wouldn't have been enough were 1983 and 1989, were 2 winters we had really severe cold. But other than that, just covering with the insulate is usually all that you would ever have to do. Remember too, if you keep them in pots, or if you're growing them in pots out around a patio, pool, something like that, anything that's raised up out of the ground is more sensitive to cold damage because the pot can freeze solid all the way through. So you're going to have to protect the bougainvillea in a pot a lot sooner than you're going to have to protect it in the ground. But even if they freeze down with a little mulch, they'll come right back out.
I see a lot of very large bougainvillea blooming like crazy in bright shade. Not in, my son has one and it gets very little sun. But
It's
in bright.
unusual. Usually they do better in full sun. The other thing too is in a lot of places that are in bright shade, when they're in bloom in the spring, they may be around deciduous trees that lost all their leaves in the winter, so they got a lot more sun during the winter months. When you get all that sun, you store all those carbohydrates, and that's what makes them bloom. I think you'll find that in shadier areas they tend to bloom better in the spring and less in the summer and fall for that reason.
Do you trim them back any particular time? I mean, before winter, after winter?
Again, the best time for compact growth is going to be after winter. Probably actually the best time is in the middle of the summer because, you know, you've had your beautiful spring flush of flowers. You're cutting them back a bit. They're going to come back out and have lots of wood to put on that huge flush of flowers in the fall. Huge flush of flowers. Say that a few times and it doesn't tie up your tongue. But the best thing is just avoid pruning. Now, one thing bougainvilleas will sometimes tend to do, especially if we have a rainy period in the summer, they will put up what we call water sprouts. It'll be a bougainvillea that's nice and spread out like this, and all of a sudden you'll have a sprout that's about as big around as your little finger and it comes shooting straight up about 5 feet. Cut that all the way back. That's not going to bloom nearly as well as the little smaller lateral shoots that it puts out. So if you have one that just suddenly starts shooting up huge shoots in the middle, cut it back. Those are not going to do much for you. Like I say, those usually show up when we have a good period of rainfall. So obviously, there are people alive today that have never seen that happen. I told somebody the other day I've got cows that had not seen green grass until about 3 weeks ago. It's been so dry that you probably haven't seen that on your bougainvilleas. But if you see them make just big, thick, thorny, straight up shoots, cut those off because they're never going to bloom as well.
Bob?
Yes?
There's 2 different plants in that pot.
Correct.
About how many different colors are there for bougainvilleas?
Oh, golly.
About.
When I look at the lists that we get faxed every week from the different growers, I'd say there are about 12 or 15 varieties commonly grown now. Of that, there are probably about 10 or 12 that are day neutral, that are really good new varieties. Overall, if